Whenever we're praying a gospel, so most of you are probably familiar with Lectio Divina, kind of reflecting on the Word, reading it over several times. That's a very good habit for you to... Emily, you've got your hand... Oh, they got the handouts over there, so you need the blue one and the, I guess, ivory-colored one to start with. So, okay, thanks. Good to see you. Yes, St. Augustine's. But I think whenever you're looking at any gospel, one of our challenges is we sometimes think these are biographies, and they're not really biographies. Most of you know that. But to understand a particular gospel, you have to kind of put yourself in the time and the place of the gospel writer. We need to hear his experience. Where does he come from? Because it's through the filter of his mind, his writing style, his cultural experience, that we begin to understand what is he trying to communicate to us. And then you look at your experience and say, what does his experience tell me about my experience? So that's kind of a way of looking at that. Then we learn from that experience and then apply it to our present experience. Now, that's very different than many of our Protestant brothers and sisters who kind of read the Bible, and most of our culture, most of our Catholics, because we're a literalist country, so we look at everything literal. We look at everything historical, because we've all been taught history. And of course, the Gospels are not history in the strict sense. That gets some people really upset. They're not to be read literally in that sense, because they're filled with symbols. They're filled with metaphors. And so often, since we're a literalist, we don't get it, because we look at, well, that's what the word says. What does the symbol mean? And take that symbol and apply it to your own life experience. So looking at Luke's Gospel, all of you know, I'm sure, that our Roman Catholic lectionary, along with the ecumenical lectionary that many of our Protestant brothers and sisters use, one of the great ecumenical gifts to our church and our world, most Catholics are totally oblivious of. Back in the late 60s, early 70s, when our 3-year lectionary was formed, many of our Protestant mainline brothers and sisters created a matching lectionary. There are a few differences, a couple different selections taken, but basically they're the same. So that, remarkably, if you went to a Catholic church on Sunday, a Lutheran church, a Presbyterian church, many Baptist churches, a Disciples church, you would hear the same scriptures because we use a common lectionary. Now, as Catholics, we use that lectionary pretty strictly. We're not allowed to change the readings on Sunday unless there's a really good pastoral reason. Perhaps if a parish was celebrating their anniversary or something, you could possibly do that. But normally, we try to follow that lectionary, and it's a great discipline to have to follow the lectionary. In some of the Protestant churches, if the preacher says, well, I don't like that reading, I'll skip that reading or knock it out, they can do that much more easily than we can do that. But it's a great gift to have this lectionary. And as you know, there's 3 years of the lectionary, and we're in cycle C. And the first year is Matthew, A, then B, Mark, and then C is Luke. That's not the order in which the Gospels were written. Most of you, I think, know that Mark's was probably the first. There's some evidence that the beginning of Matthew's Gospel may have been before Mark. But Mark wrote his Gospel roughly around 70 of the first century, a marking point, right after the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. So that's kind of the marking point. Now, Jesus' historical life probably was born somewhere between 6 and 8 BC, or BCE, before the Common Era. so our calendar's all out of date. But Jesus was born before the year 0. Probably died around 25 of the first century. So the historical life of Jesus is in the first part of the century, and between 25 and 70 is a time in which these stories were collected, put in different forms. Maybe healing stories were put together in the oral tradition. And I think all of you know all of that the oral tradition is very important. That's the only way you could preserve things, because they didn't have books like we have. And you told those stories. So between 25 and 70 was a period of the collections of sayings. And after 70, the 4 Gospels began to appear. Mark probably, as we have it first, it's the starkest of the Gospels, the simplest of the Gospels. That's why we call him Stark Mark. If you just want it, you can read the entire Gospel probably in less than an hour, which is not a bad thing to do sometime, if you've never done that before, because you get the whole picture. Probably about 10 years later, 80 to 85, comes Matthew and Luke. They know that Mark has written his Gospel. They use a lot of Markan material, but they also add their own. And each of them has a different image of Jesus that they want to emphasize, and also a different audience that they're speaking to, as Mark emphasized Jesus in a different way and had a different audience. Now, of course, the question always comes on, where the heck is John in all of this? You all know that John was the youngest disciple, probably a teenager when he was called, maybe 14, 15 years old. Fuzzy-haired kid. A little spacey sometimes, it seems, even from the scriptures. John writes his gospel much later, probably maybe in the early 90s, 10 years after, 5 to 10 years after Matthew and Luke. Father Ray Brown always told us it went through at least 5 editions. The one we have is the 5th edition, probably finished by one of his disciples. So it could have even been as late as 100 of the first century. And John, of course, writes his gospel in a totally different way, with a whole different pattern than the 3 alike gospels, Mark, Luke, and John, or Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They have similarities. John doesn't even try. He has a whole different form of his gospel. As you know, the first 2/3 of his gospel is about the great signs of Jesus, starting with the wedding feast of Cana. And his gospel is kind of woven through the lectionary, normally during the Easter season or the Lenten season. And in the Mark year, because Mark is so short, we have the whole entire 6th chapter of John, usually around August of that year, 5 straight weeks of that. But that's just kind of a at least quick overview of the timeline of these 3. You'll see this year that John's Gospel is thrown in Lent a little bit. At least one time recently we had with the wedding feast of Cana, just a couple of weeks ago. And most of the time during the Easter season, and then he disappears. So that's kind of an overview of the lectionary there. I'm sorry, any questions about that, or are you with me? That's pretty familiar to most of you. Okay. Luke. Who is this man, Luke? Well, we just heard this this past week. The very beginning, or the prologue of Luke's gospel in ordinary time, where he presents his gospel as the narrative of events that have been fulfilled among us. He begins a prologue because he's very familiar with Greco-Roman writers. He's probably in background. We're not sure. He may have had a Jewish father and perhaps or a Jewish mother. We're not sure. One of his parents may have been. So he's somewhat familiar with Judaism, but not real familiar. But he is very familiar with this culture. So he writes in a style that Greeks and Romans would really understand. He's not an eyewitness to Jesus. He was not one of the apostles, the 12 apostles, or the 72 disciples, or anyone else like that. So he never met Jesus in his life. And he admits that. He seems to be very well educated, a Greco-Roman, as I said, probably a Gentile convert to Christianity from paganism, probably not in the strict sense a Jewish Christian. And that probably influences his own, because of his experience, he speaks primarily to Gentiles and not to Jews. The oldest of the traditions say Luke possibly came from Antioch in Syria. Syria is north, Lebanon is right north of Israel, and Syria is north of that. You all see Syria every night on the news these days, unfortunately. Luke seems to know that area well. He seems to know what is Asia Minor, which is present-day Turkey, and has some experience of Greece. He's very familiar with Paul and Paul's formula in 1 Corinthians 11 about the Eucharist. When Paul, that's probably the earliest evidence we have. You know, Paul's letters were all written before the Gospels. We get that confused sometimes. Paul's letters were written from the late 40s, possibly to the early 60s. So all of his letters, and Paul is dead by the time the Gospels were written. He would not be familiar with the Gospels. Certainly we can find evidence that Luke was not from Palestine. He gets his geography mixed up several times, which is confusing to all of us, but we don't know the geography of Israel half the time anyway, so we just kind of miss it sometimes. But sometimes he misplaces things. So he's human, just like all the rest of us. By tradition, in the 2nd century, Luke is called, as you remember the term, the dear and glorious physician, a doctor. We're not sure of that, but he tells more healing stories than any other of the Gospels. That's a major theme for him, is healing, Jesus the healer. Now, there's no way to verify whether he was a doctor or not. There were a lot of healers at the time, but somehow he either has some healing sources or some people who were from the medical community of the 1st century that seemed to be a source for him because of that emphasis on healing. We also know from the book of Acts, you know that Luke wrote a gospel, and he also wrote the book of the Acts of the Apostles. And those two books are very connected. If you look at the very last chapter of the Gospel and the first chapter of the Acts of the Apostles, they overlap. So Luke really pictured those two books as connected. And if you put them both together, they're a substantial part of the New Testament. But of course, the Gospel focuses on Jesus, and the Acts of the Apostles focuses on the church, the early church, particularly Peter and then Paul. But they are connected for Luke. Acts of the Apostles probably written right around the same time as the Gospel in the 80s, 85 of the 1st century. And from the Acts of the Apostles and even Paul's writings, Luke at times traveled with Paul. They were co-workers together. How much time, we're not quite sure, but he's mentioned in Philemon, he's mentioned in 2 Timothy as traveling with Paul. He mentions traveling with Paul in Acts chapter 16 and 20 and 27. Now, it gets confusing sometimes because Luke's portrayal sometimes of Paul himself differs from how Paul sees himself in the letters. But I guess we could ask that sometimes of our own people. We sometimes look at our kids. They didn't see themselves some way, and we see them a little differently sometimes, don't we? So sometimes we see each other quite differently, but there's a different kind of view of where Paul's coming from Luke's experience and Paul's, the way he mentions that. And to some extent, although this seems a little strange, he seems to be somewhat unaware of Paul's letters and some of their pastoral concerns. he does not bring those concerns of Paul's into the Gospel or the book of Acts. That seems a little strange. So the consensus among most scholars is, yes, they probably traveled together, but not a lot. So he was a sometime companion, not one of Paul's intimate companions that was with him all the time. That makes little sense. Now, some scholars even have posed that Luke might have been a woman evangelist, and just used the name of Luke because it would be accepted in the first century, which was very patriarchal. And because Luke has more women sources and more stories about women, including Mary, than any of the other Gospels. He puts a lot of emphasis on the women disciples and the role that they played, and seems to highlight various women. He does that pretty well. Often when he tells a story, he'll tell it from a male disciple and then a female disciple. It's interesting how, if you look at the stories, sometimes even the famous stories of the lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son, prodigal son, one story is about a woman, one story is about a male, female. So it's interesting how he does that. Whatever it is, most scholars think he really wasn't a woman, but he's shaped by a circle of women disciples, and perhaps Mary herself, the mother of Jesus. He has more stories about Mary. That's where we get the Magnificat. We get some evidence of birth stories. Mary is a prominent figure in the infancy accounts, where in Matthew's Gospel, it's Joseph, not Mary. So it's very different, the two Gospels. Whether Luke knew Mary personally, we don't know. Whether he met her, we don't know. Or whether someone who knew Mary he did meet and got those stories, we're not quite sure of. But for him, Mary is the model disciple, and he shows that a lot. Okay? Where was this gospel written? We think that Matthew's was written in Antioch of Syria. Now, there's a couple of Antiochs in New Testament times. There's one in Syria, and there's another one up in what we call Turkey today, or Asia Minor. Both by the same name. They get confused sometimes. But most people think Luke wrote his writing probably in Asia Minor, present-day Turkey, because that's where a Gentile community was very strong. Whereas in Antioch of Syria, Jewish Christians were very strong, Matthew being a Jew, one of the apostles, or at least whoever wrote it knew Matthew, speaks more to Jewish Christians. So both Matthew and Luke are writing in probably different places around the same time. I mentioned before, keeping in mind the historical Jesus was from 6 or 7 or 8 BC to 25 BC, AD, and then there's almost 40 to 45 years of the collections of all these parables, miracle stories, and teachings by various groups. And it's out of those groups and those collections that the Gospels are formed. As I said before, both Matthew and Luke are aware of Mark's Gospel and use similar sources. But Luke also uses, and Matthew as well, another source called the Q source. Always interesting how these scholars come up with these names. And both Matthew and Luke seem to use that source, which is a little different than Mark. And they're probably a source that spoke to both the Jewish, Christian, and Gentile audiences and their cultures. Luke seems to have a whole other source. They call it the L source, Luke source. Because there's a major section in Luke's Gospel that's all unique to him. And many of the parables are all unique to Luke that are not mentioned in Mark or Matthew. To some extent, Luke is always an apologist for Jesus. He's always trying to proclaim that Jesus was innocent. He even has in his Passion account, Pilate saying, I find nothing wrong with this man. He's the only gospel writer that says that even Pilate says Jesus is innocent. So Luke is trying to tell everybody he's an innocent man. He's not a rebel against the Romans. Now, obviously, he's speaking to a Greco-Roman audience, and a lot of Romans would be, is this a radical insurrectionist against Rome? We're not going to listen to this guy. Luke seems to take great pains to say, that's not true, that's not true. You might have gotten that from Mark, but that's not true. So, you see there are even divisions in the first century among the gospel writers. Why should we be surprised? Who's his audience? Who is Luke speaking to? As he addresses in the prologue that we heard last Sunday, he's writing to friends, possibly his patron. Everybody had to have a patron, somebody who puts up the money for your book or the time that you're going to do that. And he refers to him as Theophilus, Theophilus, the beloved of God. Whether that's his real name or not, probably not, but he kind of mentions that person. And seems to imply that Theophilus is a catechumen. So to some extent, he's not yet baptized, he's in the process of becoming a Christian. So I'm kind of addressing this to you, to tell the story about Jesus, so that you can learn what is he all about, you can learn the good news. He writes to Gentile Christians in a prominently Gentile setting. He seldom mentions lots of Jewish traditions, their ritual purity, or details of Jewish law. Luke doesn't do that because they wouldn't understand it. So maybe he's not familiar that much with it. But he skips that. Where in Matthew's gospel, writing to Jews, he mentions and always is quoting from the Old Testament. Luke seldom does that. He even changes that famous story, where the people bring the paralytic and and they come to the house and it's full. In Matthew's gospel, it's a thatched roof, which you have to roll off the roof so you could lower the man down through the roof. That makes sense. But Luke doesn't say a thatched roof, because Gentiles wouldn't know what the thatched roof is all about. They had tile roofs. So Luke says they take the tiles off. Little different detail to show you the difference of the audiences that they're talking with. Trying to make it more familiar to his audience. He does quote scriptures. He quotes it from the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. He doesn't use the Aramaic of the Hebrew translation. He uses a Greek translation. That would be the only one his audience might be familiar with. And again, Luke, because perhaps he was a Gentile himself and became a Christian, sees Gentiles as the sign of fulfillment of the restoration of Israel promised in the Hebrew scriptures. He doesn't see the Gentiles as replacing Israel. We've got a lot of theologies that sometimes, like if you saw the Passion of the Christ, there's a lot of replacement theology. Christians are the New Covenant people, and the Jews are the Old Covenant people, out of date. That's not a good Christian theology. Luke does not see them, Gentiles, as replacing Jews, but that the fulfillment of the message of the Old Testament and Jesus' message is found in the Gentile community. So the consensus seems that Luke wrote to a mixed community of people, mainly Gentiles. Some of them were Jewish Christians. And they're trying to struggle for their identity. You can imagine this, Gentiles. If we're Gentiles, we're not Jews. But many Jews who were connected to a synagogue, and Christians came out of the synagogue experience, they don't accept Jesus. This puts us in an uncomfortable position. So Luke is trying to help Gentiles to find their identity within, are we Jews? Are we separate from? Are we connected to? Paul deals with this in his letters as well. It's kind of a struggle for our own time when we realize our Jewish brothers and sisters are really our kissing cousins in lots of ways. We are related to them in so many different ways. They're not a separate religion. And sometimes we mistakenly thought that. Again, he writes to a fairly educated audience, Greek and Romans, who are familiar with the Hellenistic style of writing and biographies of those days, and many of the Greco-Roman literary forms. That's what he uses. Let's look at the Gospel's themes, how they're a little different than the other Gospels. There are many things in this Gospel that are unique to Luke, especially the bulk of his parables between the end of chapter 9 and chapter 19. Almost 10 chapters, for the most part, are unique to Luke. We call it the Journey to Jerusalem section. You'll see that in the outline. He displays a very keen interest in relating gospel events to the broader stage of history. Incarnation is very important to Luke. God comes in human flesh. God comes in history, people, places, and events. So even in his infancy account, and you know this from the Christmas story, you know, the grief went forth from Caesar Augustus, while Quirinius was governor of Syria. He mentions all these people. The 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, under the governorship of Pontius Pilate. He's trying to place the historical Jesus and the message of Jesus within history. So he mentions all of those people. He mentions the sons of Herod the Great, who died after Jesus was born. He mentions the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, which we hear in the Passion accounts. He's trying to situate God's good news happens in history. Look at your own history, see where God is communicating to you. He sketches salvation history, how God has saved his people, and basically he sees it in 3 stages. There's the period of Israel, the period of what we would call the Hebrew Scriptures. There's the period of Jesus' ministry, the historical Jesus. And thirdly, the period since the ascension, and looking backward and looking forward to the end times, the period of the church. And so those 3 stages, he's looking back, looking at the historical Jesus, looking to the church. The entire book of the Acts of the Apostles is the beginning of that 3rd period, when you're connected. His eschatology, every once in a while somebody at a cocktail party just mentioned eschatology. What the heck is that all about? The eschaton, the end times. We have all these great Greek words, don't we, sometimes? Eschatology means the theology of the end times. He shifts in his book. Remember, Mark is very urgent, always in a rush. Jesus is probably coming back soon. Paul, in his early letters, Thessalonians 1 and 2, thinks Jesus is coming soon. So they're thinking of an imminent second coming. By Luke's time, he's saying, not so much. He turns his attention more to, let's focus not on Jesus coming back, but on the practices of daily gospel living. He sees the timeless presence of the reign of God that begins in the coming of Jesus in historical events and places, but is lived out in the historical experience of the church, the early church, the everyday experience. The end times are expected. It's going to happen sometime, and we must be vigilant, but probably not that soon. And obviously he was right about that. Luke's Christian community struggles for its identity. I mentioned this earlier. And how to understand themselves as rooted in Judaism, but now an institution apart from Judaism. Remember, if you remember your history of the first century, Christians were basically considered a sect of Judaism. Most Jews who become Christians still went to synagogue, and then they had their Sunday morning meal in a house church. They were considered part of Judaism, even in the early days of Paul. But as Gentiles come on board, Christians begin to get thrown out of the synagogue. And are we connected to Judaism, or are we separate? That's one of the struggles of the first century. And what does that mean if we're separate from Judaism? How are we connected with it? How are we disconnected with it? And it's interesting that Luke has some both positive and negative portrayals of Jews. Obviously, you can read lots of John's gospel. John is really ticked off at his Jewish brothers and sisters for not accepting Jesus. And we always have to be real careful when we read John's gospel, because so often he'll use the phrase, the Jews. What he really means is Jewish leaders. Father Ray Brown, my professor in New Testament, often said, guys, be very careful, because John's gospel has been used constantly for anti-Semitism because of that anger and the way it kind of seems to label all Jews, when it was really, he was angry at the Jewish religious leaders. So maybe when you read the gospel, thank God Ray's deceased and gone to God now, he'd probably get clipped for this, say Jewish leaders, not the Jews, because people misunderstand sometimes. God help me if I change the words of the gospel. Please don't report me wrong. But I think that's a very important thing. John, you can get a lot of anti-Semitism. You can read a little bit of that in Luke, although he goes both sides. Because both Jews and Christians, or Gentiles, benefit from Jesus' healings and his exorcisms. Pharisees are viewed for the most part positively by Luke. Now, Matthew, as you know, if you read Matthew 23, you brood of vipers, you whitened sepulchres. We would probably use other words, more expletive than those words. Matthew is very angry at the Pharisees, and you get a very negative image of the Pharisees in Matthew's gospel. Those were Jewish laymen, rather well-to-do and well-educated. Perhaps he's telling those conflicts that often come up between Gentile Christians and the Jewish brothers and sisters. It's the experience of that early church. Luke never, ever portrays Jews as being rejected by God, which is a healthy thing, because sometimes in the Christian tradition we have thought that. Now, a couple of the theological emphases that you hear as themes throughout the gospel. I know this is getting real technical. I think you're still awake, right? Everybody still out there? Okay. That are unique to Luke. As I said before, he sees the stories of Jesus being the fulfillment of the Scriptures. The Hebrew Scriptures are fulfilled in Jesus Christ. It's part of God's plan for salvation, God's faithfulness to us. So he sees that as fulfillment. Lots of emphasis on prayer in Luke's Gospel, and I'll point that out a little bit later, the many different times. The whole Gospel seems to be steeped in an atmosphere of prayer. When you look at all the characters, before they do anything, they're praying. Particularly look at the infancy accounts that we read during the Advent Christmas season. Zachariah and Elizabeth, Mary, Simeon and Anna, Jesus' parents, Jesus in the temple. They're all taking something to prayer. Jesus at his baptism is praying. And so often Jesus' prayer is a spontaneous prayer of thanks and his intimate union with God. Prayer is giving thanks, and God and I are together. So, heavy emphasis in Luke's Gospel. Another emphasis is crossing boundaries. Jesus always in this Gospel seems to be crossing a boundary. He's associating with the marginal people, the lepers, the outcasts of Jewish society, tax collectors, sinners. He literally touches the sick, which means if he touches the sick, he becomes ritually impure. So he's touching a leper, touching ears. He's touching people, that whole kind of sense of healing by touch. Crossing boundaries that the culture was saying, ooh, I'm scared of this. We just heard last week his announcement of his mission, chapter 4:18. His mission is to bring good news to the poor, as Isaiah said. Release to those who are captive, those who are bound. Recovery of sight to the blind, both the physically blind and those who can see but they don't see, as well as freedom for those who are oppressed. Those are powerful images. Those are social images. Jesus is always crossing social boundaries. He dines with Pharisees and royal officials. Seems to include everybody. Overcoming differences of race or economics or gender or social status. When there were rules and regulations, you just don't talk to women in public. You know, some people want to do that today too sometimes. He's always trying to relate to other people as part of his mission of evangelizing. He has great emphasis on the rich and the poor, possessions. Beware of possessions. Don't let material things get you down. He spends a lot of time on material possessions and discipleship. Even, Matthew has his famous Beatitudes. You can say there are 8 Beatitudes, or there are 10 if you count them a different way. Luke has his Beatitudes. Well, Matthew has it up on a hill, on a mountain, because Moses went up on the hill to get the 10 Commandments. A mountain to get the 10 Commandments. Luke's is down in the plain, down where the people are. Luke is in the valley. The poor, the physically poor, are blessed. The rich official, if he wants to join us, needs to leave everything to follow him. The difficulty of the rich to enter into God's reign. The poor widow who gave everything she had. The rich fool. The rich man versus Lazarus. Those are all unique Lucan stories to see the contrast. Be careful about those of you who are greedy or get so hung up on your possessions. Not a very comforting gospel to the affluent community. But on the other hand, there were wealthy disciples with him. Luke is not against having some money or possessions or treasure. Many of the women that hang around Jesus, Joanna, who was the wife of one of the stewards of Herod, Mary Magdalene, many think was a fairly well-to-do woman, Susanna, these were people who supported the disciples in the early church. Zacchaeus, the wealthy tax collector, the little man that we use in the children's story, but he was the chief tax collector. That means he had lots of tax collectors working underneath him who all had to give a little extra percentage to the chief tax collector. He's a man of means. The Ethiopian eunuch, that's in the backs of the apostles, works with the Queen of Sheba, obviously well-to-do. Priscilla and Aquila in Ephesus later becomes the church leaders of Ephesus. So there are wealthy people, but there's a real admonition to them to share things in common. Share what you have. If somebody doesn't have anything, make sure if you've got some possessions, you're sharing with others. The ideal is that no one should be wanting. Obviously, this is the gospel of social justice. God sides with the poor. That's sometimes a message some folks don't want to hear. I mentioned about women, or stories of women in Luke. Elizabeth, Mary, Anna, widow of Nain, that's coming up in a couple of weeks. Martha and Mary's stories. Simon's mother-in-law. There's women women all over this gospel. Now, some have used the gospel to say is Luke, because he's mentioning all these women, promoting the equality of women and men disciples. That might be a little bit of a stretch, because it's often ambiguous. He's certainly raising up women disciples, that they're important. But the women are involved often in charity. They are prophetic. Sometimes they're spokespersons for God. And like Mary, she's chosen the better part, the role of contemplation and reflection. But on the other hand, a lot of the women remain silent and passive, which of course in the first century they would be told to do. In the book of Acts, their role of women is much more restricted and controlled than in the gospel. They're disciples, without doubt, but they don't exercise ministries of preaching or healing or exorcising. That doesn't mean exercising, exorcising, throwing demons out. Sometimes exercise throws demons out too. And forgiving other people. They don't do public roles. Now, that's to say that, that's not trying to make an argument for or against the ordination questions that we get up this time. It's saying that probably nobody's ordained during this period of time, so that's an irrelevant question. Women are lifted up, but they're still not always in public roles. Another last couple of themes in Luke's gospel, the Spirit. Again, when you look at each one of the characters, the Spirit is involved. The Spirit comes upon Jesus. The Spirit pushes Jesus out of the desert for the temptations. The Spirit comes upon various people. Every character is filled with that Spirit, as well as Jesus throughout his ministry. The Spirit will be the guiding force for the disciples throughout the book of Acts. Remember the Pentecost scene in the early part of the book of Acts. So the Spirit of God, that Spirit, that force for unity, that force for love, is a driving force in this gospel, more than any of the others. Jesus seems to love to eat in Luke's gospel. He's always eating with people. It's eating where you get to know people, you relate to people, you converse with people. His life is food for God's hungry creation. He's often the guest for a meal, but Jesus is always posing challenges, sometimes gentle, sometimes not so gentle, to the host and his guests. He's always teaching at meals. Perhaps tells us something sometimes too. And finally, in Luke's gospel, there's this theme of journey. As you'll see in the structure of the gospel, you're on a journey. You're on the way. You're a pilgrim people. Remember from Vatican II. You all do remember Vatican II. Sometimes I'm not sure. There are 10 chapters, most of which is uniquely Luke, that all is called the journey to Jerusalem. Takes him forever to get to Jerusalem, but he's talking about we're on the move, we're on the way, we're heading somewhere. Obviously, there's a theme of Exodus in that, which is both, on one hand, sobering, because when we're heading to Jerusalem, where I'm going to get killed, guys, sobering. On the other hand, liberating. You know, this is where it's all going to happen. This is going to be the culminating event. One understands Jesus by journeying with him, walking with him. The metaphor, again, of the way. We walk with Jesus. We walk by faith and not by sight. Those images of Paul. And probably the classic story is the Emmaus story. The two disciples after Jesus' death, telling Jesus and Jesus talking to them on the way to Emmaus. Interestingly enough, in this year of Luke, we don't get the Emmaus story this year. It was last year somewhere, so always disappointed that in this year we don't get the Emmaus story, although we can use it a lot of times. Let me conclude this section, if you're still awake out there, with who is Jesus for Luke? Jesus, in Matthew's gospel, is the teacher, the new Moses. So Jesus is always teaching, giving a narrative. In Mark's gospel, Jesus is the suffering servant. The cross dominates. I'm going to suffer for the sake of others. In John's gospel, Jesus is the noble one, the divine one. John definitely, Jesus is divine. The one who makes the great signs, the 7 great signs, and through that points to him as God, calm, cool, and collected. But in Luke's gospel, Jesus is the healer, dominant theme, both physical healing and spiritual healing. He's the spiritual doctor. In Luke's gospel, he's the reconciler, another form of healing, bringing people together at meals. Forgiveness of sins, reconciling. Bringing families together, bringing communities together. Bringing the lost back and celebrating the lost. Bringing the world together. Reconcilers. So reconciliation, forgiveness is a major theme. He's the includer of people who haven't been included. Those outcasts, bring them in. If I get rejected by some people, go out in the byways, bring them in. The sinners, the marginalized, the people on the fringes, the lepers, the widows, children, the poor, women. How do we include them in the church? Obviously a major thing. Okay, and finally, Jesus is the universal Savior. He's the Savior not just of Jews, not just of Gentiles, but everybody in the world. The good news is to be preached to the whole world, and all are included. Gentiles, Jews, and everybody else. His is the most inclusive gospel of all the gospels. So it's a unique gospel in lots of ways. Well, let's close this section. You've gotten a lot of stuff here. Hopefully you're still awake. A couple questions here, maybe in your tables. Having heard all of this stuff, what attracts you about this gospel? That's a little different than the others. What attracts you to Luke's Jesus? On the other hand, what makes you uncomfortable about this gospel, which makes many people uncomfortable? How do you see Luke's reconciliation, his inclusion, his healing, discipleship? We're supposed to be followers of Jesus. We're supposed to be includers, reconcilers, healers. How do you see, what is that all about for us? And what are some of the tensions that brings? Now, you can't do all 3 of those questions. We don't have enough time, but maybe you could take about 10 minutes here kind of talking about pick one of those questions and chew on it a while, okay? Kind of an overview of Luke's gospel. We've looked at who he is, his audience, what he's about, his themes, but how did he structure the gospel? And on that page, I've tried to put the outline of the whole gospel before you. Basically, 8 parts of the gospel. You remember perhaps that Matthew has 5 major sections of his gospel because each of them kind of mirrors the first 5 books of the Torah. So the second part begins with a Sermon on the Mount, just like Exodus has Moses going up on the mountain to receive the 10 Commandments. Luke doesn't structure it that way, but kind of almost in a geographic way. We heard the prologue this past weekend very quickly, kind of situates it. Then we see the introduction, what we call the infancy account of the boyhood of Jesus, the Annunciation, the parallel stories of the Annunciation of John the Baptist, and then the Annunciation of Jesus. There's kind of lots of parallels like this, and lots of times that was done in the Old Testament as well with some of the other key figures, and how similar those 2 stories are in many different ways. The Annunciation announcing the coming to Elizabeth of John the Baptist and Mary, Jesus. Lots of different songs are canticles. Mary visits Elizabeth. Often questions about why is this young woman traveling alone, going from Nazareth to Ein Karen, which is a suburb of Jerusalem, and staying for several months with Elizabeth while she's pregnant and Mary's pregnant, away from her parents, away from her village. What does that say about what's going on? We don't know. But then that great Magnificat song, which sums up in many ways a lot of Luke's themes. As Mary proclaims the greatness of the Lord, he will bring down the mighty from their thrones and raise up the lowly. That's a pretty radical statement. Romans probably didn't like to hear that. Or anybody else who's on top, that you're going to be pulled down and those on the bottom are going to be lifted up. This is no mealy-mouthed young girl here. The Magnificat, and it's the Canticle of Simeon. Many of these canticles we use so often daily in the divine office, the liturgy of the hours, morning and evening prayer. The narratives of the birth of Jesus, his circumcision, and the naming of both the Baptist and the naming of Jesus. And then the boy Jesus, as you mentioned, Sandy, of the boy Jesus in the temple, as the only story of the childhood of Jesus. So only Matthew and only Luke have infancy stories. John doesn't have it. He has that very long prologue of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. That's as close as it gets to an infancy account. Mark, of course, starts with John the Baptist in the desert. And Matthew and Luke's stories are very different. I think the real unfortunate thing is for kids, and I know we got to do things for kids, but somehow we never, when we grow up, we never get it straight, that it's all intermeshed. So we've got the Magi and the shepherds at the crib scene, but they're in different Gospels with different emphases. Matthew's Gospel is driven by Joseph, the dreamer, like Joseph in the Old Testament, the dreamer. We have the story of the Magi, the astrologers, the holy innocents, the crosses behind the tomb, or crosses behind the crib in Matthew's Gospel. But in Luke's Gospel, it's Mary, it's the angels, it's shepherds. The characters are different emphases. The shepherds are the outcast, the dirty job, the lowest paying job possible. They're the first ones invited to the birth of the child. It carries Luke's themes with it, but very, very different stories. And those infancy accounts were obviously added probably later to the Gospels than early on. Section 3 is Jesus' preparation for public ministry in chapter 3. We've heard some of that lately. The Baptist is preaching Jesus' baptism in the Jordan River. There is the genealogy of Jesus, and we'll hear on the first Sunday of Lent in a couple of weeks, the temptations of Jesus. You might notice that when we have the temptations, the first Sunday of every Lent is the temptations. Last year with Mark, it was Jesus was driven into the desert and tempted by the devil. Doesn't say anything about the temptations, what specifically they are. Mark is very stark. It's interesting to look. This year we'll have Luke's 3 temptations. Matthew has 3 temptations, but they're in a different order. We'll talk about a little about Luke's a little bit later. Sometimes it's interesting to see those 2 Gospels and say, why did they mention the temptations different? Was it because of the community they were preaching to? And then we begin to see Jesus' public ministry in Galilee. We've seen part of that as he announces his mission in the synagogue, gets thrown out of the synagogue. Today, this weekend, we'll hear the story. They take him to the brow of the hill and want to throw him over, but he walks through the crowd and says, "Bye, y'all. I'm heading to Capernaum." Capernaum is this little town not very far away at the northwestern corner of the Sea of Galilee. It's a town where Peter's mother-in-law lives. Her house has been excavated. It's a house with 33 rooms in it. Peter married into some money. wasn't exactly a poor fisherman. And Jesus used that house as kind of his school for the disciples and their families. It's where a synagogue is right near that house. But it's on the road. If you go from Cairo up the Mediterranean Sea across the Jezreel Valley and up to the Sea of Galilee and head on up to Damascus, everybody passes right through Capernaum. It's a little town of maybe 25,000 people, which was a key town in Galilee. That's where Jesus uses as his headquarters. He gets all kinds of people there. There are different reactions to Jesus in Galilee, controversies with the Pharisees. He chooses the 12, preaches to the multitude on the plain, the Sermon on the Plain. There are 4 Beatitudes, not 8 like in Matthew, and there are 4 woes. It's interesting to look at those. Blessed are the poor, not the poor in spirit, as Matthew says. No, blessed are the poor, and woe to you rich, which makes us uncomfortable sometimes. Lots of miracle stories and parables show Jesus' power in trying to reveal who is this Jesus. And Jesus has his mission. What's the mission of the 12? We see in these Gospels. We'll see how this breaks out in the lectionary a little bit later. As he reveals his identity, there are questions about his identity. Remember again, Luke is trying to say, what's our identity as Gentile Christians? What's Jesus' identity? What would be our identity? The character of Herod, the feeding of the 5,000, Peter's confession, profession of faith, the first and second passion predictions, and the transfiguration, which will be the second Sunday of Lent. Every year we get the 3 different versions of the transfiguration, and they're all just a little bit different. Then we began this major section, probably a key section in Luke's Gospel, from the end of chapter 9 to the middle of chapter 19. 10 full chapters, almost half the whole Gospel. Most of this is unique to Luke. There are a few little things in there, but almost everything, and almost all the parables are unique to Luke. As he heads to Jerusalem on the way and all the experiences, going through Samaria. Again, a good Jew never walks through Samaria. You avoid Samaria. You know, they're the ones that reneged on their Judaism and worshipped at a different mountain. You walk around Samaria. You don't walk through Samaria. But Jesus walks through Samaria. Of course, Jesus in Luke's Gospel tells the story of the good Samaritan. Can there be a good Samaritan? Those people are lousy. But of course, the good Samaritan does what God calls us to do, whereas the priest and the Levite did not do it, probably for other reasons. They had to follow the rules. They didn't want to get unclean. Can't blame them totally. But somebody's beat up in a ditch. The Samaritan takes care of them. Maybe that's what we should be doing too sometimes. Oops. Last part of the Gospel, 6, 7, and 8, ministry in Jerusalem. Once he gets there, the entry into Jerusalem Palm Sunday, activities around the temple area, the end times discourse, that eschatological, the last things discourse, which we'll see at the very end of our lectionary year. And then, of course, the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus, talking about the Last Supper, the conspiracy against Jesus, the arrest in the Mount of Olives, the Jewish trial, then the Roman trial. It's interesting that in Luke's Gospel, Jesus does go before Herod. Of course, this is not Herod the Great, the one of Jesus' birth. This is a later Herod. The way of the cross, crucifixion, and burial. And then in chapter 24, we see the resurrection appearances in the Jerusalem area. Other Gospels talk about Galilee. Luke has it still in Jerusalem. The empty tomb, the classic story of the the road to Emmaus, some appearances in Jerusalem, and the ascension into heaven. Luke ends with the ascension. In the book of the Acts of the Apostles, he begins with the ascension. So the two books are together. So that's kind of a filter for you to look through it. Later on, what I've tried to do as we go through the lectionary in a few moments, where those parts are in our lectionary. It sometimes gets mixed up a little bit, but hopefully you can see that. A quick overview of the lectionary as we see it. What do we hear? We've just gotten through Advent, Christmas, Holy Family, Epiphany, the Baptism of the Lord. You kind of see, having seen that outline, we started with the end times message, the first week of Advent. Second week, John the Baptist in history. Remember, Luke's always trying to place people in the midst of history. The third week of Advent, the visitation of Mary and Elizabeth. And then, of course, we hear the Christmas stories for Luke, shepherds and angels, the circumcision of Jesus, Jesus lost in the temple, and then the baptism by John on the Feast of the Baptism of the Lord. That's kind of the season we've just come out of. Now we got this for 4 weeks of ordinary time, pretty short. So we go back to the beginning of the gospel, the prologue, a couple of weeks ago, and Jesus announcing his mission. Last week, or actually this week, excuse me, a prophet without honor in Nazareth. After he's announced his message, they say, "You're a little much for us here," because Jesus, as the prophet says, you know, the widow of Zarephath followed the good news. Naaman the Syrian soldier followed the good news. Those are foreigners. What? You're talking about non-Jews here. We don't like that. Get him out of here. We know this kid. He just grew up in our land. You know, we're not going to listen to this kind of stuff. So he gets rejected, as most prophets do get rejected. And evidently doesn't spend a lot of time back in his hometown because they knew him too well. They didn't want to hear the message. Sometimes that happens to some of us too, occasionally. Prophet without honor in his own parish. I notice there's a lot of laughing at that table back there, so watch out for those folks. So we got basically chapters 4 and 5 here. Then we jump into the Lenten season. The first Sunday, of course, as I said, is the Temptation Sunday. Luke 4. Next Sunday, Luke 9, Transfiguration scene. Now, I presume most of you have catechumens, so if you've got catechumens, you don't use the C cycle, you use the A cycle, and we'll focus on that in a few minutes. But if you use the C cycle and have no catechumens, the 3 weekends, 3rd, 4th, and 5th week, are dealing with violence in Galilee. These people, the tower fell on these people, this happened here, the fig tree, the prodigal son story, we do hear, the lost son here, and somehow the 5th week got skipped out of there. Those blasted computers sometimes do strange things on you. Then the Passion, Palm Sunday, Jesus' passion and death. And then on Easter, Luke's version of the resurrection. The women go to the tomb first. Angels tell them he's been raised up. They go tell the disciples Jesus has been raised, and they all said, yeah, but you're women. They don't believe, but just to make sure, Peter does race to the tomb to find out for himself. Interesting Lucan story. The women are the first ones to announce the resurrection. They're the prophets, but sometimes are rejected, just as Jesus was. During the Easter season, all of our readings are basically John readings, except on Ascension Sunday, which is the old 7th Sunday of Easter, the Sunday before Pentecost now is Ascension Sunday, gives us Luke's version. On Corpus Christi Sunday, the multiplication of the 5 loaves and 2 fish from chapter 9. So we jump around a little bit. Then we get into the summer, the 10th Sunday to the 16th Sunday, those 7 weeks. We're basically dealing with chapters 7 and 8. Jesus is anointed by a sinful woman, accompanied by several women. Chapters 9 and 10, beginning a little bit, the very beginning of the journey passage, to the crowd Siam, take up your cross and follow me. He travels through Samaria and is rejected. The disciples say, rain down fire on these guys. No, we don't do that. Follow me, and there's no excuses. Don't say, well, I'm too busy. Oops. He appoints 72 other disciples. Travel light. Whatever house you receives you, accept it. Demons will be subject to you, which is the greatest commandment. Love of God, love of neighbor. Who's my neighbor? Let me tell you the story of the parable of the Good Samaritan. That tells you who your neighbor is. And then the story of Martha and Mary, that classic story. Mary's busy about hospitality. It's too much, and my dumb sister is just sitting there doing nothing. Do something, Jesus. Well, now be careful. Mary has chosen the better part. You know, you gotta reflect some once in a while and not work all the time. Of course, it might be good for Mary to do a little work once in a while too. We probably need to balance the two. It's not an either or, it's both and. As we move to the late summer, 17th through the 24th Sundays, we look at Luke 11 and 12. Luke's Our Father, persistence, ask and you'll receive, seek and you shall find. Again, notice prayer and all that. Guard against greed. The rich are going to find it hard to get into heaven. Sell your possessions if you're rich. Your treasure is where your heart is. Be vigilant because you don't know when the master is going to return. Have I come to bring peace? No, I've come to set the earth on fire. Homes are be divided, mother-in-law against daughters, etc., etc. Luke 13 and 14, strive for the narrow gate. Some will not enter. If you don't show up, I'll say, you show up late, I don't know who you are. The last will be first. When invited to a meal, take the last, please. Those who exalt themselves are going to be humbled. Invite in the outcasts. You know, don't always do the ones that have to owe you something. Invite in those people that can't pay you back. Chapter 15 is those 3 great lost parables. The lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. And they're very interesting to read all 3 together. Sometimes we separate them out. But if you read them all together, the absurdity of all 3 is amazing. We'll talk a little about that later. The late fall, September to November 25th to the 34th Sundays, Luke 16 and 17, there's a whole group of parables. The enterprising steward, you know, he may be crooked, but at least he's thinking creatively. How come Christians don't think creatively, you know? But we've always done it this way, Father. You know, well, maybe we need to rethink that a little bit. Be creative and trustworthy, Jesus says. The parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Lazarus is sitting right outside his door, and he doesn't even see him. Walks right by him every day. Doesn't even notice him, you know. Send Lazarus to tell my brothers. Well, if they won't listen to the prophets, are they going to listen to somebody who comes back from the dead? Like Jesus, who came back from the dead? Who will listen to Moses and the prophets? Increase your faith the size of a mustard seed. Do your job and be grateful for it. Don't say, I did a great job. Everybody, hello, I did a great job. Hey, look at me. No, do your job. Be grateful. The parable of the 10 lepers, but only one of them came back to thank God, thank Jesus. What happened to the other ones? The parable of the widow and the unjust judge. The widow comes in and raises her cane at the judge, and I'm going to whoop you. You know, if you don't give me what I want, no, I'm not a God-fearing man, but I got to get rid of this widow, do what she wants, get her out of here. The parable of the publican and the Pharisees, publican, not Republican, excuse me. The parable of the publican and the Pharisees, it's about humility. The story of Zacchaeus, we use it with kids all the time because he's little, but it's really an adult story about someone searching for their faith and someone who ripped people off and says, I'm repenting of that, I'm going to repay what I ripped people off about. And the end of the year, the debate over the widow of 7 brothers, which one is the husband in the next life? The Sadducees thought this is a really important thing. Jesus said it ain't important in the next life. In time of the temple destruction, wars and violence, persevere, hang in there. Those things are going to happen. And Christ the King Sunday, if you're the King of the Jews, save yourself. And Luke's unique story about the good thief. The 2 thieves argue with each other and the good thief. So that's kind of that outline that you've got to see of the whole gospel, how it's laid out in the lectionary for you. Most of it in ordinary time kind of follows pretty consistently, but it gets jumbled a little bit. That's always the danger of the lectionary is if our people aren't reading the Bible every day or following it. I know all of our people read the Bible every day and every week. They're reading the readings before they come to church every Sunday. I know that happens. It all gets jumbled up for them. But maybe we can help them to say, where is this all being situated? So let's take a couple moments to reflect on that a little bit. What do you see is missing from the gospel to get the full flavor of Luke's gospel? Not a lot of parts are missing, but a few. And how do you see this liturgical year having different emphases, as you said, the different images of Jesus? What are we going to emphasize differently this year than we did in the Matthew or the Luke year, or the Matthew or the Mark year? And what is it that Luke gives us that we do need to hear, even if we don't want to hear it? Take one of those questions and break it apart a little bit, and then we'll go into the last section. I forgot to mention on the blue section, I did put a little bit bibliography on the back page of the blue section of some of the stuff that I've used. Some of you perhaps are familiar with some of these as catechists that might be helpful. Diane Bergant has done 3 volumes, and I didn't bring hers with me, on the Preaching the New Testament, which is a great tool to use. She's also more recently done a smaller booklet for each season, A, B, and C season cycle. Has a little commentary on the scriptural readings, about 2 or 3 pages long. The other one is much more detailed, maybe too much, but both of those are good sources. Always got to give a plug for my professor, Ray Brown, who I was privileged to have for 3 years in scriptures and to be a good friend. His introduction to the New Testament was one of his last books that he wrote. It's still a classic. Like the Jerome Biblical Commentary is still a classic, and his Gospel of John is still a classic. He wrote so clearly. It was a privilege to know the man. But his introduction to the New Testament is such an excellent book. Plum Perkins's book I find very helpful, Joseph Kelly's book. If you're not familiar with John Pelch's writings, he has actually 9 little booklets about the cultural background of the first reading from the A cycle, first reading B cycle, first reading C cycle, second reading A cycle, B cycle, C cycle, and gospel A, B, and C. So 9 little booklets, usually about a page or a page and a half, looking into the cultural background. And he makes so many points that help a lot of times in preaching and looking at things that help you. If you're not familiar with his books, they're very good. And last is Barbara Reed's. I've also been privileged to know Barbara. When I was on sabbatical, I was with her for about 3 months. Incredible teacher. She's the dean of Catholic Theological Union, and Marina and I are going to get her into Louisville sometime soon, although she's in great demand around the country. But she said, I can hop a flight from Midway Airport. I'd love to come to Louisville. But she has done 3 volumes, A cycle, B cycle, C cycle. This is the C cycle for Luke on the parables. And it is incredibly good. She literally has about 9 pages on each parable, stuff you never would have thought about. She's an expert on parables, and obviously an expert on lots of women in the Gospel of Luke. She's written a book on that as well. But I just love her stuff. She's very, very clear. If you need some resources, I thought those might help you a little bit. So, okay. So we've got about 55 minutes or 54 minutes, something like that. We'll probably go through this a little quicker. I've got broken down the lectionary into 7 stages. Obviously the Advent Christmas stage, then Ordinary Time, then Lent and Easter, then 3 sections of Ordinary Time to kind of break it up. And I've got questions after each section. These are some questions that might help you in sometimes your reflection in the catechumenate. We can't obviously do all of those questions, so I will ask you as we finish the section maybe to take one of those questions and just kind of, as you looked at that section of lectionary, take one question and discuss it a little bit to kind of put it in your head. So what I've done here is I've taken the outline of the gospel that you already saw, dropped it in here, as kind of the prologue, the introduction, preparation for ministry, those first three sections of Luke's gospel. And again, you begin to see how in the Advent Christmas Epiphany baptism of the Lord, you see where these sections come in. Luke talks about at the end of one cycle of year and the beginning of a new, remember, think Jewish, not American. We think in cycles, circles, not lines. So it's not 2011, 2012, 2013. We always start where we end. And you end one year usually with Christ the King, and the end times, the second coming of Christ. And the beginning of a year, you're thinking of the first coming of Christ at Christmas, but really we're preparing for the second coming of Christ. So it's like we start where we end, and we end where we start. Now you're completely confused. But our Jewish brothers and sisters think in terms of circles, and the circle keeps rolling rather than linearly. Again, why a lot of people don't understand Scripture sometimes. The end times as a focus for, we're not waiting for the birth of the baby Jesus, we're waiting for the adult Jesus, and how is he coming into our history and times right now, not 2,000 years ago. That's really hard when you've been hearing Christmas carols for a month since Halloween. The second week is John the Baptist comes in history and time. Luke, interestingly enough, tells a lot of the stories of John the Baptist, and then when he's imprisoned by Herod in his gospel, that's when Jesus ascends. As John says, actually this comes from John's gospel, I must decrease, he must increase. Luke shows that very clearly with John the Baptist, but sees him as a parallel figure with Jesus. The famous story of the visitation of Mary and Elizabeth. Mary, a young woman, perhaps 14, 15 years of age. Every time I look at my 8th graders, I go, oh my God. To think of Mary to be that age. Elizabeth, we by tradition, an older woman, probably means she's in her late 20s. I think that's a very, 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 very young woman, because everybody in my parish is young. But these two women, the contrast, both pregnant, and their interesting relationship, how God is working through their lives. Elizabeth celebrates Mary. Mary proclaims the greatness of the Lord with the Magnificat. talked about the Christmas stories, angels, shepherds, Jesus being taken by his parents 8 days later to the temple to be circumcised, and then the story of Jesus being lost in the temple. The kind of background behind that is, of course, at the age of 12, usually a child under 12, a boy, is pretty attached to his mother for the first 12 years, and the father doesn't have a lot to do with him. As he becomes into maturity, then the boy is sent to learn what it means to be a man with the father. So Jesus is kind of caught in the transition period. Mary probably thinks he's with Dad, and Dad thinks he's with Mary, and or with some of the relatives, because they probably traveled as a group. They're 3 days out and said, "Where'd the kid go?" And then spend 3 days looking for him in Jerusalem and find him in the temple, asking lots of questions. And then he was a little snippy with Mom, you know, I need to be about my father's business. Mary and Joseph don't seem to be too happy with that, but he, as Luke says, goes back to Nazareth and grows in wisdom and age and grace before God and before men and women. Powerful images there. Obviously, Matthew's Gospel from the Feast of Epiphany, the foreigners, the Magi, that's Matthew's Gospel. It has nothing to do with Luke. Herod rejects Jesus, is kind of announcing that there are other people going to reject Jesus as well. We do have Luke's version of the baptism by John the Baptist. The Spirit comes upon him, that image of the Spirit. "This is my Son, in whom I am well pleased." That line gets repeated a couple of times in Luke's Gospel. So, we've just come out of that season. Just to reflect for a few moments, maybe, where do you see Jesus? Who is Jesus in these stories of Luke that we've just been? How does Luke's infancy account teach us about the core of Luke's Gospel? Obviously, it's different than Matthew. Maybe take that first question and just kind of reflect on, you just come out of that experience of hearing the lectionary. What did you learn this year that was different about Jesus than you have any other year? A couple of you mentioned that. We'll take about 5 minutes to do that. Let's move on to the next section here. We'll kind of do both ordinary time and a little bit of Lent, so that we can get to lunch. If you look at the bottom of that first page, the ordinary time, 3rd through the 5th Sundays that we're in right now, are basically dealing with the ministry in Galilee, the 4th section of Luke's Gospel, his rejection in Nazareth, later on Capernaum, Sea of Galilee, reactions to Jesus, as you see in chapter 5. So if you flip it over, in the 2nd Sunday of ordinary time, suddenly John showed up, as he often does, and we had the wedding feast at Cana. Obviously not Luke. Lots of folks think it's about weddings. The story is not about weddings, although it happens at a wedding. The abundance of covenantal relationships, the relationship of families, the relationship of communities, the relationship with us with one another, and turning the ordinary into something extraordinary, water into wine, and doing it in an abundant way. If there are 6 stone water jars of roughly 25 gallons each, that's 150 gallons of wine. Remember, weddings in the 1st century usually were celebrated over 3 days. So the party went on for 3 days. If they were running out of wine, they had 150 gallons to go. Lord knows. I don't know that party went, but Jesus likes a good party, evidently. Then the next 3 Sundays, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus' public mission in Nazareth, when he announces his mission from Isaiah, preaching good news to the poor, liberty and freedom to captives and the oppressed, giving sight to the blind, a year of favor from the Lord. Obviously, Jesus can read. Not everybody in the first century could read. That was somewhat unusual. And reading from the scroll. This week we hear of Nazareth is skeptical. We don't like to hear about Gentiles like the widow and Naaman, and that they see more clearly than Jews do. Get out of town, boy. And next week we'll hear the call of the first disciples. Their first response is, ooh, we're scared of that. Depart from us. Jesus says, don't be afraid, but be willing to leave it all. Again, you hear that sense of Luke's gospel. You need to get your priorities straight. You know, don't be attached to things or even sometimes people. A couple of questions we could raise there, and maybe you can do some of this later. Jesus' mission is also the disciples, the church's mission. How do we see that lived out in our parishes and our world today? Luke sees Jesus as the prophet spokesperson for God without honor in his hometown. How do we honor the prophets in our own time, our own parish sometimes? The call of Jesus is given, and the disciples are first afraid, then drop everything to follow him. In what ways do our people think of Jesus' call to them means? When we tell our people, you know, Jesus calls you. Sometimes I have blank stares when I say that in the pulpit. Huh? You know, what do you mean he calls me? That each of us has a call. Oh, it's just the priests and nuns have call, right? We don't have calls. No, we all have calls. Whoever we are. Let me go on to the Lenten season. That's right upon us here. First Sunday we'll see, as we talked about before, led by the Spirit, driven by the Spirit into the desert, and the three temptations of Jesus. Luke orders them bread. One does not live by bread alone, just food. That could be lots of different metaphors for food, but it's not just food that runs our life. It's not just worship our success. It's not power. And we have a temptation to consume, a temptation to want to be successful. Everybody look at me, worship me, look how successful I am. And I got the power and you don't. Don't forget that. Those are constant temptations we all have. Matthew reorders those for his own community. The next week, second Sunday, we hear the transfiguration scene. Elijah and Jesus is transfigured. This is obviously probably a vision scene, an alternate state of consciousness scene that happens often with Middle Eastern people. It's a little strange to us Western Americans. Whether it's historical or not is not terribly important, but they had an experience of Jesus that was much broader than the historical Jesus. Something about the resurrection, something about the risen Jesus. Probably looking back into the scriptures for this scene. Elijah represents all the prophets, Moses, the law, Deuteronomy, and Exodus. We're going to set up 3 tents for each of you. Lord, it's good for us to be here, Peter says. Yes, it is. But then it all goes away. And a voice says, listen. Listen to him. How are we transformed? How are we transfigured by this good news? Especially during this Lenten season. This is the season of purification, getting rid of some things we need to get rid of in our lives, our sin, our inclinations. It's also the season in which we need to be enlightened. How do we see things in ever new and fresh ways that we haven't looked at before? I mentioned before the cycle, obviously you've got catechumens, you've got the 3 readings of the woman at the well. On the 3rd Sunday, the Samaritan woman at the well. That's John's gospel, but she is a Samaritan. She's a woman, she's a Samaritan, and she's got quite a few husbands. 3 strikes against the woman. No wonder she comes at noon and not in the morning when you normally would come when it's cooler. She wants to meet anybody there. and yet she meets Jesus, and yet she's converted. She goes out and starts spreading the good news to the community. A woman, of all people, doing that. She becomes the evangelizer of others because of her experience of Jesus. The man born blind. He can't physically see, but he sees who Jesus is. He hears Jesus' message, understands Jesus better than those who have sight, like the Pharisees, and the raising of Lazarus, that he's brought back to life, given new life, but the fact that Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, for the Pharisees and chief priests, is like the last straw. We got to kill this guy, because he's doing things we don't like to see. You give life, and unfortunately you lose your life because you're giving life. All great stories for catechumens as well as candidates. Then as we move to Palm Sunday and Holy Week, again, chapter 7, or the 7th section of Luke's Gospel, the conspiracy against Jesus, you see how that comes here. And Luke's passion and death, or excuse me, Luke's version of Jesus' passion and death, he's the only one that has Jesus appear before Herod. The other Gospels do speak of Jesus and Pilate, but only Luke tells the story of Herod meeting Jesus. This is Herod, the son of Herod the Great, Herod Antipas. We get all those Herods mixed up sometimes. And it's Pilate in Luke's Gospel that says, this man's innocent. I don't want to deal with this man, Again, Luke's emphasis on the innocence of Jesus. And Jesus speaks in the Passion as a martyr. I'm willing to give my life for the sake of others. And he forgives his enemies. Lord, they not know what they're doing to me. That whole forgiveness theme, even from the cross. And then only Luke has the two criminals, the two thieves. They fight with each other about who Jesus is, and one says, Lord, I'm a sinner. Remember me when you come into your kingdom. This day you shall be with me in paradise. On Easter, of course, and after Easter, in some years, chapter 24 we'll hear on Easter. We won't hear the Emmaus story. That's in another year. We will hear the Ascension story on Ascension Sunday from the 8th and last section of Luke's Gospel. In Luke's Easter story, on the Easter Vigil, the women went to the tomb. The angels tell them he's been raised. They go tell the disciples, as I said before. The disciples say, we don't believe these women. But Peter says, just to make sure, I'm going to go check out this tomb. So often we get rejected by that. So, ordinary time, perhaps looking at how do we see Jesus' mission lived out in our parishes today, as we go through the purification and enlightenment. How does Luke's Gospel help us in this season of purification and enlightenment? What does Luke see us to be purified of or enlightened by? Maybe reflect on those two questions for about 5 minutes, and then we'll move on. Well, let's come back together and we'll look at the Easter season and then the early ordinary time. I'm on the bottom of page, or midway through page 11, the Easter season. As you look at the Easter season, the Sundays after Easter, you see they're almost all John. Easter and following, Divine Mercy Sunday, Thomas doubts, whose sins you forgive, they are forgiven. The second Sunday of Easter. The disciples are out fishing. Jesus appears, cast your net on the right side. Peter jumps in. They have a fish breakfast. It's amazing to have fish during Easter season rather than Lent. But, and that famous story of Simon, do you love me? In John's Gospel, 3 times, feed my lambs, feed my sheep. The 4th Sunday, the so-called Good Shepherd Sunday, very simple gospel. The sheep hear my voice and follow me. The next Sunday, the Son of Man is glorified. Love one another as I have loved you. The next Sunday, whoever loves me, we will dwell with them. My Father will send the advocate. Peace I leave with you. The advocate brings you peace, the advocate being the Spirit. On Ascension Sunday, we do have Luke's Gospel, 24. The next Sunday on Pentecost, we're back to John again. The Holy Spirit will teach you everything and remind you of all that I told you. On Trinity Sunday, there's no St. X Sunday, only a Trinity Sunday. Sorry. The Spirit of truth will guide you. I was getting in trouble when I said that. And then on Corpus Christi Sunday, we do go back to Luke's Gospel, chapter 9, for the multiplication of the 5 loaves and 2 fish, which is in the other Gospels as well, but a little bit different than Luke. Obviously, we could do a lot of questions here, and the second question there, perhaps in the Easter season. Remember, Easter season is, we've been through Lent, we've witnessed the resurrection. How do we make that resurrection happen in the life of the church, in the life of the community? Where do we see resurrection in our community? So we're sent on mission. We've gathered during Lent, we've reflected on purifying ourselves and enlightening ourselves during Lent. How do we go out to mission? So the catechumenate should be sending us into mission. Discipleship in Luke's Gospel involves a diversity of people, men and women from all social categories. They confess their sins, they repent, they leave everything, they follow him with single-minded devotion. How can we communicate a message in positive light in our world today? That might be a good question to reflect upon sometime with your groups. Luke, and several of you have mentioned this before, the next question on danger for Luke is that concerns of daily life and material possessions can rob people of their enthusiasm for the gospel. Don't we have that problem in most of our parishes? Every pastor I know kind of goes nuts when you've only got 10 to 15% of your parents in the school that ever show up on Sunday. Like, but they go to Mass on Thursday, Father. What about you? Oh, well, we don't have to do that. We were at church on the weekend. We went to the kindergarten basketball game. We went to the football game. That's church. No, we're talking about something different, but that's a problem that sometimes people don't understand. Mary seems to be Luke's model of the first disciple. What do you like about Luke's message? What makes you uncomfortable? We could talk about the new evangelization. Luke's gospel is a great gospel for talking about evangelization. As we end that season and go into the early part of the summer, in June and July, again, we're back to Jesus' finishing up. Earlier on in ordinary time, that ordinary time we're into right now, talked about the first part of the mission in Galilee. The second part of the mission in Galilee will be in June. The miracles and parables that show Jesus' power and his identity, and questions about his identity. Then we begin the journey to Jerusalem, that big passage of journey. So the 7 Sundays in the summer, Jesus raises the son of the widow of Nain from the dead. Brings life to a widow who's going to be penniless because she can't inherit money, but her son can. But if he's dead, she's penniless. She's without a home or anything. So he's not only bringing the son back to life, he's bringing the mom back to life too. Lots of other stories there. The next one, Jesus is anointed by a sinful woman, probably not Mary Magdalene, although sometimes we've thought she was. But he's accompanied by several other women, Joanna and Susanna. Jesus seems to hang with lots of women. That's a little dangerous in public because men are not supposed to be seen in public with women. Women have their thing, men have their thing. Even when the multiplication of the loaves and the fish, so often they break people up. The men sit in a group, and the women and the children sit in another group. Not mixed up sometimes. We forget that. Who do the crowds say that I am? Take up your cross and follow me. He begins to travel in the journey passage through Samaria and gets rejected by the Samaritans because he's a Jew. He's from Jerusalem. The disciples say, okay, we didn't like these people to begin with. Let's rain down fire on these people. Thunder and lightning. Jesus says, calm down. We'll just keep on moving. Continue to follow me without excuses. Next Sunday, Jesus appoints 72 other disciples. We sometimes get confused that the apostles are disciples, but they're the 12, the apostles. But there are many other disciples, at least 72 others, some of them male, some of them female. Carry little for the journey. Whatever house you enter, accept it. Even the demons will be subject to you. Which is the greatest commandment. Love God. Love neighbor with all your heart, mind, and soul. But then the question happens, well, who is my neighbor? And that's when Jesus tells the Good Samaritan story. Or Luke tells the Good Samaritan story. Only Luke has that story. We're familiar with it, but it's loaded with all kinds of implications. A Samaritan does something good. He's touching a person that's bleeding, makes him ritually impure. That's why the priest and the Levi walk by, because they got jobs to do. So don't be too hard on all the priests when they do those kind of things, as we so easily do sometimes. There may be other things we don't know about. Then the Martha and Mary story, the great story of hospitality, these two sisters who are very close to Jesus. But Martha's worried about everything, like most of us. Working too hard, working too fast, not having enough time to pray or to think. Her life's out of balance. And of course she gets mad at little sister because, she's not helping a lot, but she's kind of listening to Jesus. And women weren't supposed to be sitting with the men listening to men talk. So Mary's breaking a little rule there, but Jesus says, she's chosen. You need to be reflectors. You need to contemplate things. Where's their balance in our lives? Perhaps we could reflect briefly, that journey theme is so prominent in Luke's gospel. How do we prepare ourselves for a journey? We can all think about when we go on vacation, what we do in our preparation, something like that. But how do we prepare for a faith journey? Our journeys have, faith lives have ups and downs. How do we walk with people during those journeys? Our journeys, we cross borders all the time. We cross boundaries. Have you ever had a boundary crossing you experienced yourself that opened your eyes to something? How did it affect you? How can we encourage people to cross a few boundaries sometimes? It gets pretty scary for people because we want what we want when we know. What we don't know, we're scared to death of. Maybe take one of those questions and reflect on it briefly, and then we'll finish up the last two sections. Well, let's come back together and do the late summer and the fall ordinary time. The bottom of page 12 there, 17th Sunday to the 24th Sunday. We're into the journey, remember. Luke 11, the 17th Sunday, Luke tells us the Lord's Prayer. You'll notice that Luke's version of the Lord's Prayer is different than Matthew's version, slightly. We're used to the Matthew version. Sometimes with Protestant Catholics, we get these two versions mixed up. Prayer again, emphasize the persistence. Be persistent in prayer. Get up, get moving. Ask and you shall receive, seek and you shall find, that passage. The next Sunday, somebody brings a question to Jesus and, well, who appointed me as your judge? Guard against greed. tells the story of the foolish rich person who builds barns and builds barns and builds barns and dies the next day. Are you not rich in what matters to God? Keep your perspective about these possessions. And again, I don't think, as somebody raised it somewhere, it's not always how much you got. I've known some very, very, very well-to-do people who are very detached from their stuff, which is kind of amazing. I remember one family, one of them is deceased now, but I remember many years ago being at their house, and I just thought there was a painting inside their hallway. I said, wow, that is the most gorgeous thing I've seen. Before I left in the evening, my husband said, if you really like that, you can keep that. You can take it home with you. I said, where the hell would I put it? I said, you got to be kidding me. I said, that looks expensive. No, but you really appreciate that. I'll give it to you. There were two people who were very, very generous in so many different ways, well-to-do, but not attached. I've also known poor people who are very poor, but by God, this is mine, So it's not how much you got, but your attitude about what you got that I think is Luke's point. Sell your possessions. Your treasure is where your heart is. Lord knows that can be hard on all of us. Be vigilant, for you never know when the master's coming home. Be prepared. And then Peter says, what does this parable mean? And Jesus explains the parable in more detail. I've come to set the earth on fire. I'm not this passive guy. I want to get people excited. I want people to be fired up. Sometimes I'm going to bring division in households by what I say. So much for the nice, sweet Jesus. I think too often, please, Catechists, don't get upset at me. I think it's great that we deal with kids, but too many adults still have a kid's understanding of Jesus. I hear it all the time. Well, Jesus tells us to be nice. I'm nice. So what? Well, sometimes Jesus isn't always nice. Get behind me, Satan, to Peter. You whitened sepulchre, you brood of vipers. Jesus pushes us too, and sometimes we miss that because we've got the childish notion of Jesus. That if you follow the Christian message, you're going to divide households. Get ready for it. Well, then only a few can be saved, Jesus will strive to enter through the narrow gate. Some won't enter. Some will arrive late and will say, you had your chance. I don't know you. The last will be first. Again, he reminds us. When invited to a banquet, we've heard this story in many of the other Gospels. Luke tells it a little differently. Always take the last seat. Don't take the first seat. Those who exalt themselves are always going to be humbled. And invite people who can't pay you back. Invite the outcasts. Carry the cross. Now, Mark emphasized the cross much more than Luke, but think ahead. What's it going to cost you? Sometimes in possessions, sometimes in family relationships. If you're a Christian, you may alienate some of your family. Hello, anybody have that experience out there? And if you can't renounce your possessions, if you're so attached to them, then you really can't be my disciple. You've got to say, I'm not attached to those things. And we can say we're not attached, but we are. Then those three great lost parables, they're absurd. And I think we miss it. We love the lost sheep. The shepherd goes after the lost sheep and leaves the 99 to go after the lost sheep. Isn't he great? Isn't he fantastic? He went after that little lost sheep. Isn't that cute? Of course, the shepherd's responsible for all 100 of them. What's going to happen to the 99 if he goes after the one lost one? They're all going to be lost too. And he's going to get H-E-double-L-L for losing them all. So it's absolutely absurd. Everybody thinks to go after one lost sheep. You lose one, you'll lose 99, but God would do it. And of course, the lost coin. The woman loses a penny in her house, and turns the whole room upside down and cleans the whole house because she lost a penny. How many of you here do that? You know, and then throws a party, which costs a lot more than a penny. That's absurd. But God would do it. That's the setup for the prodigal son or the prodigal daughter, you know. The son says to the dad, I want my inheritance now. I can't wait till you kick off. Please give it to me now. And what dad was going to give it to him? You were crazy to give it to him. And then he does exactly what you were worried about. He blows it all on wine, women, and song. And starts having to slop hogs, which we don't want to deal with pork and all that kind of stuff. So the son says, I don't deserve to be a son anymore. Just if I could be a hired hand, that would be good enough. But the father's waiting for him and welcomes him back and puts the ring on his finger and a cloak, new shoes, sandals, all that stuff, and is welcomed back. But the older brother is really ticked off. And of course, that's like all of us. Well, we've been going to church for the last 400 years, every Sunday, and you welcome that person in who hasn't been inside this church in 30 years. You know, it isn't fair. But God loves us all. We're both accepted. Those are obviously Luke's classic ones, but there's so much more to those stories than we sometimes tell. It's a great story for reconciliation, but let's do it as adults sometimes and not just for the kids. Questions we could ask here. One of the groups was talking about the whole evangelical counsels. We talk about poverty, Francis of Assisi, obedience. And obedience really means listening well. Obedire comes from audire. Are we listening well? So in obedience to parents, are we listening well? Or in obedience to a bishop, I need to listen well, but he needs to listen to me occasionally. And it should be a two-way street sometimes. Warns against materialism and control by your possessions. That's a counterculture value to our society. How do we live that out? Luke is over and over again emphasizing humility. It comes from the word humus. Humus means earth. We got our feet on the ground. We're well grounded. That's what humility is really all about. That's countercultural because our culture says, yay me, yay me, yay me. But how do we have a healthy balance between self-worth and recognizing our dependency on God? You know, sometimes we have to give every kid a trophy now because, you know, we don't want them to feel bad about themselves. Well, there are hard knocks in life. And sometimes I think some of our young people, young adults, are like, oh, I've never had a hard knock in life. My God, I'm having a hard knock. I can't deal with this. Well, we need to have some balance about that. I talked about 3 parables, but I think a lot of people still image God as the punisher God or as the distant lover God. How do we make these children's stories adult stories? Let's look briefly at the last weeks, last 9 weeks. Again, all these great parables we'll have in September, October, and November. They're all great stewardship parables, too. This is the great year to talk about stewardship in the fall. The parable of the enterprising steward. He knows he's going to lose his job, so he makes a couple of extra deals with people. And we think, well, Jesus ought to condemn this guy for, cheating. And he said, well, at least he's creative. How many of us as Christians are not very creative, not very trustworthy? We'll spend a lot of money on some stuff, but, we can't possibly spend money on advertising because that's a waste of time. When big corporations, what is it this week for the Super Bowl tomorrow? $4 million for a 30-second commercial. $4 million for 30 seconds. Can we buy one? But that's a waste of money when we're not being creative sometimes. The parable of the rich man, the poor Lazarus. Lazarus is right by the door and he doesn't see him. Well, they'll listen. If they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, they're not going to listen to somebody who comes back from the dead. We think that story means Lazarus. It means Jesus. Increase your faith the size of it. Do your job. Be grateful. We've done what we're supposed to do. We don't need to be glorified for that. But sometimes we want glory. The 10 lepers, one foreigner, again, a foreigner, non-Jew, is grateful. The other ones were not so grateful. The great story of the unjust judge and the widow, her persistence keeps coming at him, and finally he gives in. The famous story of the publican who says, I'm a sinner, I don't deserve something, versus the Pharisee, look all that I've done here, God, praise to you, I'm great, look at me. Which one is more in right relationship with God? Zacchaeus, small in stature, but a tax collector, but he repents. Jesus goes after the person who can repent, even though everybody's mad at him. The debate with the Sadducees over who's the husband in the next life, you're not asking the right question. Jesus is always reframing the question. You ask me a question, I'll reframe the question. Good Jew that he is. The end time is coming. You're going to hear murmurs of wars. In Mark's gospel, it's very scary. Luke's gospel, yeah, the temple was destroyed. Yes, we're going under persecution. Don't panic. Persevere. The King of the Jews, save yourself, good thief. Lots of parables here. You might want to reflect on what's your favorite parable and why? What's your least favorite parable and why? What sometimes prevents me from getting the full flavor of Luke's gospel? What of his themes give me the greatest challenge? And what do I like best about the gospel? Its positiveness, as Debbie said. How well do we understand Jesus as the healer, the reconciler, the includer, the universal Savior? What comforts us about that? What challenges us? And having reviewed Luke, do you see his emphasis differently than Matthew or in Mark? What do you find most helpful in living out your own faith? This afternoon, as we go through RCIA, to some extent, sometimes we all pattern our RCIA as the same thing every year. I'll be arguing against just having a series of topics because you're missing the flavor of the Gospels. There are things that you're going to emphasize stronger in Luke year, Matthew's year, or Mark's year, along with John. Our catechesis should be a little bit different because of the Gospel that we're reading, because that's the text, not the catechism. The Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But anyway, and I know it's time